The real reason Japan lost the Battle of Midway has little to do with code-breaking or luck. Instead, it begins with deep weaknesses inside the Imperial Japanese Navy, weaknesses that ensured defeat long before American dive bombers arrived over the fleet. The force that had started the Pacific War, struck Pearl Harbor, and advanced across thousands of miles of ocean was suddenly gone. For decades, most accounts have presented Midway as a dramatic reversal brought about by American intelligence and a fortunate turn of events. These factors influenced the battle, but they did not decide it. Japan entered the Midway operation carrying failures built into its command system, its battle doctrine, its pilot training, its reconnaissance efforts, and the very design of its carriers and aircraft. Senior commanders were divided by distance and policy, unable to coordinate during critical phases. At the same time, doctrine required elaborate symmetrical air operations and slowed responses to fast-changing threats. Meanwhile, carrier air groups arrived at Midway depleted and fatigued after 6 months of continuous operations. On top of this, intelligence assessments underestimated American strength and left the fleet unaware of its opponent's movements, and design choices that favored offense over defense created deadly weaknesses once the carriers were struck. After the war, Japanese officers identified a single underlying cause. They called it victory disease. It was a belief that previous successes confirmed the soundness of their system and that future operations would unfold the same way. As one officer observed, even if the fleet had avoided disaster at Midway, the same failures would have produced a similar outcome elsewhere in 1942. What follows examines 7 failures that made Japan's defeat at Midway inevitable and shows how these failures unfolded before the battle began. The first failure began at the very top of Japan's command structure. Section 1. Broken Command. To understand why Japan lost at Midway, one must first understand how Japan planned to fight the battle. The operation was supposed to be Japan's greatest naval victory. Instead, it became a study in how divided command loses wars. The Japanese forces sailing toward Midway were divided into 4 major groups, each with different objectives and none in direct communication with the others. First came Vice Admiral Nagumo's carrier striking force, the Kido Butai, carrying the offensive punch. Far behind, more than 300 miles to the rear, came Admiral Yamamoto's main body of battleships, including the massive Yamato. A third group carried the troops and equipment to invade and occupy Midway Island itself. And a fourth force sailed north toward the Aleutian Islands. This was not merely a feint, as sometimes claimed, but an actual invasion intended to seize American territory. According to Prange in his book Miracle at Midway, this plan was like a monster with 2 heads. One head was focused on seizing Midway according to a fixed invasion timetable. The other was focused on luring the American fleet into a decisive battle, a goal that required flexibility and rapid response to changing conditions. These 2 objectives pulled against each other. The author describes it as chasing 2 hares at once, with the predictable result that Japan caught neither. These split forces created problems before any shots were fired. Admiral Yamamoto insisted on directing the entire operation from his flagship, the battleship Yamato. This vessel was positioned more than 300 miles behind Nagumo's carrier striking force. In the book Shattered Sword by Parshall and Tully, this distance hampered Yamamoto's control of the battle from the very start. He was, as one analyst put it, always 2 jumps behind the action. The Japanese maintained strict radio silence throughout the approach to Midway. This policy prevented coordination between the widely dispersed forces. As a result, Yamamoto could not communicate effectively with Nagumo. Meanwhile, Nagumo could not coordinate with the submarine forces. The various task groups operated almost independently, unable to share critical information or provide mutual support. Parshall and Tully describe Yamamoto's battle plan as a crazy quilt of formations and objectives, none of which were mutually supporting. Forces were spread across thousands of miles of the Pacific Ocean. When problems arose in one area, other forces could not reinforce or assist. Crucially, as revealed in the book, there were no wrenching reassessments regarding how strategic command was exercised within the Navy after the Battle of the Coral Sea just weeks earlier. The problems with dispersed forces and poor communication had already shown themselves. Still, no lessons were learned and no changes were made. This was not simply Yamamoto's personal failing, but an institutional command failure that the entire Japanese naval establishment accepted without question. Yet, the problems extended far beyond Yamamoto's remote position. Vice Admiral Nagumo commanded the 1st Carrier Striking Force, the heart of Japan's offensive power. However, his command environment was dangerously inadequate. According to Partial and Tully, Nagumo was stuck in a cramped fishbowl aboard the carrier Akagi. The command bridge was uncomfortable, noisy, and distracting in the extreme. Even the ship's public address system was barely audible above the constant din. Nagumo had to share this cramped space with the ship's captain and his own flag staff. Only about half of his staff could fit on the navigator's bridge at any given time. Decision-making under these conditions was slow and difficult. Partial and Tully conclude that Nagumo was merely the ringleader of a traveling circus and had hardly anything to do with its success. The problems worsened with Nagumo's chief of staff, Rear Admiral Ryunosuke Kusaka. As stated in the book Shattered Sword, Kusaka lacked real expertise. He recognized the potential of naval aviation and wanted to be associated with it, but his training and personal insights into air power were limited. His lectures were remembered not for teaching aerial tactics, but for discussing aerial philosophy. Crucially, Kusaka was unlikely to take bold actions when the need arose. At Midway, bold action would be exactly what was needed. As if these problems were not enough, key staff officers fell ill at the worst possible moment. Commander Minoru Genda was hospitalized with pneumonia just before the battle. Based on historian Prang's documents, for 3 highly critical days immediately before the attack, Nagumo was without the direct support of the officer best qualified to advise him on naval aviation matters. Genda had been the tactical mastermind behind the Pearl Harbor attack. His absence left a significant gap in Nagumo's planning and decision-making. Likewise, Commander Mitsuo Fuchida was incapacitated. He had led the airstrikes at Pearl Harbor and was expected to do the same at Midway. Instead, an appendicitis attack left him bedridden and unable to command. The force structure itself was dangerously thin. 2 battleships, 2 heavy cruisers, and a light cruiser were slim cover for 4 aircraft carriers. Yamamoto's main battleship force was positioned so far behind the carriers that, as Prang observes, it might as well have remained in the inland sea to save fuel. When one of the legs of the operational table was kicked out, according to Partial and Tully, the entire structure promptly collapsed under the weight of its own foolishness. By contrast, the Americans operated under clear, unified direction from Admiral Chester Nimitz at Pearl Harbor. Nimitz gave his commanders specific objectives and trusted them to execute. As a result, information flowed freely and decisions were made quickly. Japan's command was broken at every level. But even with stronger leadership and better coordination, the fleet would still have faced a crippling problem. Japanese doctrine valued perfection over speed. Section 2. The Doctrine of Delay. The Japanese Navy believed above all things in massing air power. Delivering concentrated firepower at range was considered the most effective way of attacking the enemy. Japanese carrier commanders looked for solutions that allowed air power to be deployed in large, coordinated waves. In theory, this approach made sense. Massed attacks could overwhelm enemy defenses and deliver devastating blows. However, this doctrine created a critical vulnerability. The weakness of this approach, as Partial and Tully explain in Shattered Sword, becomes clear when one considers that in combat, there are other factors worth considering besides mass. Most notably, there is speed. Thus far in the war, the Japanese had never faced a situation where the speed of launching aircraft might be more important than the size of the attack. They had always struck first, with time to prepare perfect strikes. They had never been caught off balance. At Midway, they would be caught completely off balance. The answer came in the crucial hours of June 4th. When Nagumo learned that American carriers were nearby, he had 64 armed aircraft available for immediate launch. These planes were loaded with torpedoes, the ideal weapon for attacking ships. This force was easily capable of sinking 2 American carriers outright if properly employed. It represented more than twice the total firepower that Japan would actually manage to throw at the American carriers during all of the day's later actions. Yet Nagumo hesitated. Launching a partial strike would have broken the neat coordination that Japanese doctrine demanded. Such a move was something that no by-the-book Japanese commander would have viewed favorably. Nagumo chose to wait, to rearm aircraft, to prepare a perfect coordinated attack. He traded decisive firepower for perfect form. The Americans, meanwhile, threw everything they had at the Japanese fleet as soon as they could. American attacks were uncoordinated and often suicidal. Torpedo squadrons attacked without fighter cover and were slaughtered. But they kept coming. The Americans succeeded through individual initiative on the part of a few outstanding leaders. They improvised, adapted, and pressed their attacks regardless of losses. The Japanese system could not adapt when coordination broke down. At Midway, Japanese air doctrine failed to react to urgent circumstances. But Japan's rigid doctrine was only one part of a larger problem. Their carrier air groups had been quietly deteriorating for months. Section 3. Exhausted pilots and blind intelligence. By June 1942, Japan's carrier force was not the same weapon that had struck Pearl Harbor 6 months earlier. The problem began with how Japan trained its pilots. Before the war, Japanese naval aviation had focused on quality over quantity. Training was extremely demanding. Only the best candidates survived the tough selection process, and classes were deliberately kept small. This produced superb aviators, but it created no steady pipeline of replacements. Japan had no equivalent of the advanced carrier training units that America was rapidly expanding. As historian John Lundstrom documents in his book The First Team, there were constant shortages of spare pilots even before a single battle had been fought. When experienced air crews were lost, there was simply no way to replace them quickly with pilots of equal skill. This bottleneck, as Craig Simons notes in the Battle of Midway, would prove devastating once combat losses began to mount. This approach worked only as long as Japan avoided heavy losses. That was about to change. In May 1942, the Battle of the Coral Sea tore a hole in Japan's carrier aviation that could not be repaired in time. The carrier Shokaku was badly hit by 3 bombs, which wrecked her flight deck, started several fires, and killed 108 crewmen. The carrier Zuikaku, though physically undamaged, was effectively knocked out of action by aircraft losses. Her air group had been shattered, with many of her best air crews dead or wounded. Japanese assessments concluded that neither carrier could be used in the next operation. Rebuilding Zuikaku's air group alone would require 2 to 3 months, which meant both carriers were unavailable for Midway. Nagumo had originally planned to have his 6 Pearl Harbor carriers available. Instead, he lost 1/3 of his anticipated carrier strength before the battle was even off the planning boards. Yet Zuikaku could have been made available if her presence had been considered vital. She had returned from Coral Sea with 56 aircraft, roughly equivalent to the totals being carried by each of the other carriers at this time. Aircraft and pilots could have been transferred from Shokaku to fill out Zuikaku's air group. However, Yamamoto apparently did not feel any sense of urgency regarding her participation. Such was the cool assumption of superiority that the Japanese did not rush repairs or replenishment. The situation aboard the remaining carriers was equally troubling. Each of the 4 carriers at Midway had suffered a 16% decrease in its fighting power since December. Akagi was down from 66 to 54 aircraft. Kaga went down from 75 to 63. Soryu and Hiryu were each down from 63 to 54. There were no spare aircraft to feed into the formations. The losses at Coral Sea had removed 30 to 40% of experienced aircrews from the 5th Carrier Division. Genda and other senior aviators would later lament that the green replacements rushed in to fill the gaps could not match the skill and judgment of the pre-war elite. Nagumo was thus fighting the decisive battle with only 60% of the air power he might reasonably have expected to use as recently as May. Worse, the remaining aircrews were tired and less sharp than they had been at Pearl Harbor. Japan's aircraft production crisis made replacement impossible. As Partial and Tully note, Japan would produce just 56 carrier attack aircraft during all of 1942, a figure entirely insufficient for replacing ongoing combat and operational losses. Production of carrier bombers and attack aircraft had temporarily ground to a near halt. Despite this, Japan remained confident because they believed they knew where the Americans were. They were completely wrong. Japanese intelligence failed at almost every level before Midway. These failures built on each other, with each breakdown making the next one worse, until Nagumo was effectively blind. At the strategic level, Operation K failed. This was the planned flying boat reconnaissance of Pearl Harbor. It was aborted because the refueling point at French frigate Shoals was now occupied by American forces. This meant no fresh reconnaissance of the American main fleet base. Nagumo had no confirmation whether American carriers were in port or already at sea. At the operational level, the submarine picket line failed completely. This cordon was supposed to detect any American carriers sailing from Pearl Harbor toward Midway. Vice Admiral Teruhisa Komatsu commanded the submarine force, but he was preoccupied with follow-up plans to attack the Panama Canal and paid little attention to the details of the deployment. The submarines assigned were old vessels under refit, intended for the reserve fleet. They had no overlapping fields of observation. Most critically, the submarine line arrived late, after the American carriers had already passed through. Worse still, Komatsu failed to report this lateness to his superiors. Yamamoto and Nagumo had no idea their intelligence had failed. They assumed the submarine cordon was in place and functioning, and that if American carriers had sortied, they would have been detected. But both assumptions were wrong. At the tactical level, the scout plane from the cruiser Tone was launched 30 minutes late due to a catapult malfunction. When it finally reported contact, the message was vague. It mentioned 10 surface ships, with no mention of carriers. The crucial detail that a carrier was present came only later, after precious time had been lost. Ironically, Akagi's own intelligence estimate before the battle had noted increased American patrols and submarine activity around Midway and Pearl Harbor. Warning signs existed, but Nagumo did not meaningfully revise his plan. The assumption of American passivity was too deeply ingrained. Unbeknownst to the Japanese, American codebreakers under Commander Joseph Rochefort had penetrated the JN-25 naval code. The Americans knew roughly what Yamamoto planned: the target, the timing, and the forces involved. While Japanese reconnaissance was failing at every level, the Americans were reading their enemy's mail. Japan sailed toward Midway expecting to surprise a sleeping opponent. Instead, they were sailing into an ambush. The problems did not stop there. Japan's weaknesses extended even to the physical design of their ships. Section 4. Vulnerable ships and flawed strategy. Japanese carriers were highly capable offensive weapons. However, they had critical defensive weaknesses that would prove fatal at Midway. Unlike American and British carriers, which had partially open hangar decks that could vent explosions and allow bombs to be thrown overboard in an emergency, Japanese carriers had fully enclosed hangars. This design kept aircraft protected from weather and enabled faster operations in normal conditions. But it also meant that any explosion inside the hangar would be contained and magnified, like a firecracker in a tin pot. Kaga's hangars alone contained roughly 20 torpedoes, numerous 800-kilogram bombs, and 250-kilogram bombs, according to Partial and Tully. This added up to approximately 80,000 pounds of explosives scattered around the aircraft. Once fire broke out, there was no way to throw this ordnance overboard. The enclosed hangars became death traps. When American dive bombers struck on the morning of June 4th, they caught the carriers in the worst possible condition. The flight decks were full of armed and fueled aircraft. More aircraft in the same condition waited in the hangar decks below, ready to be lifted. Moreover, there had been no time to return the 800-kilogram land bombs to the magazines. As Prang describes, down in the hangars, crews sweating in their short-sleeved tropical shirts and shorts were unloading bombs and piling them carelessly near the aircraft instead of taking the time to return them to the magazines. This created catastrophic conditions when the bombs struck. On Akagi, explosions from stacked ammunition and a chain reaction of flaming aircraft turned the carrier into what Admiral Kusaka called a burning hell. Kaga suffered a similar fate when one bomb crashed through the elevator and exploded among the fueled and armed aircraft on the hangar deck. Another bomb struck a small gasoline truck near the island, and flaming debris killed everyone on the bridge. Soryu was consumed even faster. Fires enveloped the whole ship almost immediately, and the heat was so intense that it melted and warped the hangar deck doors. Exactly half an hour after the first hit, the captain ordered the crew to abandon ship. The critical weaknesses in Japanese damage control worsened the destruction. Post-war American assessments found that damage control, as understood in the United States Navy, did not exist in the Imperial Japanese Navy. Japanese carriers lacked the backup systems and training that might have saved them. When Kaga's fire mains were wrecked, there were no backup pumps. Worse, Japanese ships relied heavily on officers to manage technical systems. When those officers were killed, as happened on Kaga's bridge, no one else knew how to operate the equipment. American carriers practiced damage control constantly, drilling crews in watertight integrity and firefighting, whereas the Japanese carriers did not. When disaster struck, American ships like Yorktown could absorb tremendous punishment and keep fighting. On the other hand, the Japanese ships burned. Adding to this disaster, the human cost was worsened by a shocking oversight. Japanese overconfidence was so overwhelming that they did not even take the basic precaution of requiring carrier crews to wear proper combat clothing. War experience had proven that any covering, even long-sleeved shirts and trousers, helped protect against burns. But serene in their conviction that the enemy could not touch them, carrier crews worked in tropical shorts and short-sleeved shirts. As a result, many sailors suffered horribly and unnecessarily from burns. Additionally, Japanese carriers lacked radar, a technology that might have provided earlier warning of the incoming American attack. As Prang notes, perhaps because of the combined fleet's battleship orientation, no Japanese carrier entered the battle equipped with radar. 2 experimental sets were available, but they were installed on battleships assigned to the Aleutian Diversion Force instead. The Zero fighter, Japan's premier naval aircraft, reflected the same philosophy that had shaped carrier design: offense at the expense of defense. The Zero was designed for range and agility at the cost of survivability, as Lundstrom documents in the first team. It lacked armor and self-sealing fuel tanks. Early combat against weaker opponents in China had convinced the Navy that this trade-off was acceptable. By 1942, however, American fighters using incendiary ammunition turned Zeros into fire hazards. A single hit could ignite the fuel and destroy the aircraft. In both ship and aircraft design, Japan had sacrificed defense for offense, assuming they would always strike first. At Midway, they did not strike first, and they paid the price. These design choices reflected a deeper flaw in Japanese strategic thinking. The entire Midway operation was built around the concept of Kantai Kessen, the decisive battle. Japanese naval doctrine held that a single overwhelming victory could break the enemy's will to fight. According to Prang, Yamamoto had written in January 1942 that after occupying Midway, Japan should send forces forward to occupy Hawaii and at the same time bring the enemy fleet into decisive battle. Genda himself favored the Midway plan because he expected it would provide a chance of forcing a decisive battle with the American main force. This would bring about the long-sought decisive engagement between the Japanese and American fleets. However, the decisive battle concept rested on a critical error. Japan believed that destroying the American fleet would break the American will to continue the war. They failed to understand that American industrial capacity and national determination could not be defeated in one battle. Despite Yamamoto's role in developing carrier aviation, battleship thinking still dominated Japanese planning. The very title of Yamamoto's force, main body, was significant. As Prange observes, for all his lip service to naval air power, Yamamoto still visualized the battleship as the queen of the fleet. His real mission was to wait for the carriers to chop the American fleet into bite-sized morsels, and then his battleships would grind them into hamburger. The surface battle that would justify this plan never came. Behind every failure was the same blindness. The Japanese called it victory disease. Section 5. The inevitable defeat. Victory disease was the belief that past success guaranteed future success. The experience of the past 6 months had filled Japanese commanders with a deep contempt for American naval aviation, as Prange documents. Practically everyone thought that the battle was already won. Senior officers believed that the greater part of the American fleet was in the Atlantic and that Japan held superior naval power in the Pacific. They could not help but win if their forces were properly handled. Unfortunately, this confidence blinded them to danger. Commander Chihaya observed that the crews of the 4 carriers were in high spirits, feeling like conquerors before making the test of strength. Such an attitude, however, is fatal in modern warfare. Men full of hope and high spirit are apt to be reckless. They become careless about precautions and dismissive of enemy capabilities. Chihaya later made a devastating admission about Midway. In historian Prange's book, he stated that Japan had as good as planned for the defeat. If they had escaped disaster on that occasion, they would have met the same fate somewhere else in the Pacific during 1942. The defeat was preordained, he said, because it was visited upon the Japanese Navy to penalize its absurd self-conceit. Chihaya went further, stating that it could not honestly be said that everything humanly possible had been done to ensure victory. The failures were not accidents or bad luck. Instead, they were choices, institutional choices that reflected arrogance, rigidity, and contempt for the enemy. Midway was not decided by luck or code-breaking alone. It was decided by system-wide failure meeting system-wide strength. 7 connected failures, working together, destroyed Japan's carrier force at Midway. First, command was broken. Yamamoto directed the battle from 300 miles away, always 2 jumps behind the action. Nagumo struggled in a cramped, noisy bridge. Key staff officers were incapacitated by illness. Forces were dispersed beyond mutual support, chasing 2 hares and catching neither. Second, doctrine was rigid. Japan's obsession with coordinated mass attacks overrode the need for speed. 64 armed aircraft sat waiting while commanders preserved perfect form. Third, air groups were depleted. Each carrier had lost 16% of its strength since Pearl Harbor, according to Partial and Tully. Coral Sea had cost them experienced air crews who could not be replaced. Nagumo fought the decisive battle with only 60% of expected air power, and the remaining pilots were tired and less sharp. Fourth, intelligence failed completely. Operation K was aborted. The submarine picket line arrived late and went unreported. Scout planes launched behind schedule with vague reports. American carrier strength was completely misjudged. Japan had no idea its intelligence had failed. Fifth, ships were vulnerable. Enclosed hangars became fire traps. Damage control was nearly non-existent. Carriers were caught with armed and fueled aircraft on deck. Bombs piled in hangars, crews in tropical clothing, and no radar. Sixth, strategy was flawed. The decisive battle philosophy sought to break an American will that could not be broken. Contempt for the enemy blinded Japan to an opponent that was fully alert. Seventh, victory disease infected everything. Overconfidence led to careless planning, dismissed warnings, and contempt for the enemy. It was the root cause that made all the other failures possible. Together, these failures sealed Japan's fate before the battle even began. Midway's historical significance cannot be overstated. The battle ended Japan's Pacific offensive, and from that point forward, they would never advance again. As Partial and Tully argue, Midway restored the balance of naval power in the Pacific and opened the door to the grinding struggle that would follow in the Solomon Islands. It is worth correcting a common myth. The elite Japanese aviators were not mostly wiped out at Midway. The real catastrophic losses of Japan's remaining veteran aircrews came later, in the brutal air battles over Guadalcanal and the Solomons throughout late 1942 and 1943. Midway cost Japan its carriers, but the Solomons cost them their remaining experienced pilots. The battle also proved that aircraft carriers had replaced battleships as the decisive weapons in naval warfare. Yamamoto's main body never fired a shot. From that point on, the war would be decided by flight decks, not gun turrets. Most importantly, Midway demonstrated that organizational failures, not just tactical mistakes, lose wars. These were not the failings of one admiral or one battle plan. They were the failings of an entire military culture. The war would continue for 3 more years across thousands of miles of ocean. For Japan, every battle that followed would be fought with the shadow of Midway overhead. The question was no longer whether Japan could win, it was how long they could hold on. However, Japan was not the only Axis power that lost because of systemic failures. Germany's defeat followed a similar pattern of overconfidence, poor planning, and fatal miscalculations. To understand the real reasons Hitler lost the war, be sure to watch that video next.